everyone, it's Caroline Hines, film critic and journalist, and this is one of my special interviews for KCrushAmerica magazine. And today I'm very happy to be joined by filmmaker Priscilla GalveZ and writer Maisie Jacobson to talk about their film A Fermenting Woman, which showed at the 2024 Minikino Film Week in Bali, Indonesia. I wish I could have been there, and we're not there, but we're here in Toronto. And so the film is about this fermenting chef. So I actually did some research, and so they're called fermenters, and their specialty is working on like creating fermentation projects. So like you have oils, or you have people who make things like vinegars, and there's even a dish in the film, natto, which grosses me out when I look at it. I said I'm gonna try it to get over my squeamishness, but I don't think so, because it just looks gross. But things like that, like if you know kimchi is a fermentation project. So there's all of these things that this chef, Marielle Lau, is doing, but her restaurant is about to be taken over by new owners, and she's stressed, and she's anxious, and she's afraid, and all of this drives her into becoming kind of like a mad scientist, coming up with this new weird innovative dish that she hopes can save her career. So I'm very happy to be talking with Priscilla and Maisie about this. I could say very unique, and it's a body horror film, and it's like, and some people call it a comedy, but I actually kind of call it a mystery, because it's a mystery like how women think and how we use our bodies to achieve our goals. So I'm very happy to be able to talk to them today. So yeah.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. So I first have to ask you, Maisie, how on earth did the idea for this film come to you? Because as I said, and I don't think there's a way to really escape saying that the film is about period. It's about the menstrual cycle of a woman, and I think what that does to her psychologically and physically, but how it ties into work, you know, and how having our period actually affects the way we do our jobs, and how our jobs actually affects the way we live with our period. So talk to me how you came up with the idea of like, say, I'm going to make a film about periods, but I'm going to make it about a chef too.
Well, the idea actually was Priscilla's.
Oh,
Priscilla came up with the idea, so that's her brainchild. So I'll let her answer that.
Tell me, how did you?
Okay. So the idea, I guess, I'd always wanted to make a movie about a woman and her relationship with her period.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's just like a fascinating subject, because as women we live with this experience on a regular basis for a good chunk of our lives, and I've even done the math too, and it is also interesting to like think about how much of our lives is like dedicated to even just considering, like not necessarily thinking about our periods, but considering it. And I joke because there's always like, this is very niche, but there's always like the week before your period where you can already like feel it coming, and then there's also like the week after where you feel like amazing and you're just like coming off of it. So that's like basically 3 weeks of your month. So so really it's like a good chunk of our lives. And so I just thought it was like initially, like the seed of it was like a woman has a relationship, like a friendship almost, with her period, that, and I love monsters and body horror, and so I always wanted the period to kind of manifest in like a monstrous way. So that was the seed of the idea. But around the time when I was like seriously considering making the movie, I'm not a writer, and so I really needed, I wanted a collaborator to kind of shape the story with me, and that's where Maisie comes in. And we did a lot of like back and forth brainstorming, and I think the themes and, you know, I think the role of the chef, a lot of it was like sort of inspired around the time of the pandemic, and I got a bit obsessed with food because that's all you could do. I
think all of us I think we all found something we kind of got obsessed with during lockdown. For me, I bought bread flour, yeast. I said I'm gonna bake these breads. I still haven't baked anything, but that was my goal. I was looking up so many recipes on baking bread. It was on Instagram, and I really got into like Instagram recipes and stuff too. I completely related. I think food was a thing for a lot of people.
I think it was, and I think it was like, I think it's like reclaiming a bit more control over, you know, like how you live your life, and I think that was, it's a bit of a jump, it's a bit of like a mishmash of like a lot of different things, but I think her position as a chef was really inspirational and like really relevant, and we together related to the chef role because of I think of her as an artist, and I think we as creative people are artists, and I think we're kind of in this moment where food and being a chef is a creative process, and so, or like starting to become, and is now regarded as a creative process, which I think like I'd say 10 years it really wasn't. So yeah, that's sort of how it's come together, but a lot of like back and forth with Maisie and kind of like honing in on who she was.
And how did you get involved with the project, Maisie? And what was your idea? What were your first thoughts when Priscilla brought this whole concept to you?
Yeah, I mean, Priscilla and I knew each other, I guess, mostly like through film stuff, and knew some filmmakers in common and stuff. And Priscilla came to me with the idea and was very kind of cagey about it at first. Was sort of like, I have this idea, it has to do with food and fermentation, and sort of like it took a few emails to get her to kind of admit, and then she was like, and I was just looking at the emails before, and it was so funny because you were like, when you actually told me what the concept was, you were like, I'm so sorry I didn't mention this before, I should have brought that. But when I read it, I was just like delighted. I thought it was such a brilliant idea and so weird and so unique, and yeah, I was really excited to delve into it with her, and I, had my own kind of connections to the topic and my own interest, and it was sort of like, it felt very, it felt like a really exciting collaboration to me.
Yeah. The film it is a lot visually. Like I had this conversation recently with Tiff because I saw the film The Substance, and I am not good with body horror. And one of the reasons I'm not good with body horror is I don't know if it's an empathic response where like if I see someone getting cut, like I can kind of feel it sensation wise, and like so like, and because there was one point in my life I wanted to be a nurse. I volunteered at Sunnybrook Hospital in the emergency room for a year. I don't have a problem with actually seeing blood and none of that, but it's the actual seeing things happen that I'm just like, like no. Yeah. And so when I see film, when there's films that has stuff like that, for me it's very much of a physical reaction where I'm just like, I can't see people getting their heads chopped off because it's just a thing. But your film really did test my boundaries. And I was proud of me because I made it through. I will admit, there were some scenes I had to like skip like 5 seconds because I'm just like, props again to the sound designers, because the sound design really does play a big part in one of the reasons why me and body horror in film does not work, because hearing it and seeing it is like in combine is a lot. So like the sound team, sound mixer, you did a fantastic job. But I love a film like this because again it challenges people to really look at women and especially as us as women who have to experience periods, we've been taught so much to be afraid of our periods, to even talk about it, to be ashamed of this thing that is a normal bodily function. So when you have a film that's saying, look at this and look at what it's doing to this chef, look at what it's doing to Marielle, you're challenging the audience to like really think about what this means. So I just have to say, like, I think you both did a fantastic job in just like attaching it to her career, rather than it just being this thing that happens to her strictly for horror purposes. You're like, it has a purpose within the plot. So I want to talk to you about that, about making her period literally center to the story. And I think that's metaphorically appropriate because our uterus sits in the centers of our body. It's right in the center. So that's where it is. But you're just like also for the film and the story, like her period is central to the plot. So just talk to me about that first, about just like wrapping your heads around making a film about periods and about bloody periods and about someone who uses her period blood as a part of her cooking process.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the self-sacrifice element of it is really interesting to me and isn't something that is usually talked about in relation to periods. That felt like a really unique angle, which was Priscilla's angle. Yeah, I guess the self-sacrifice stuff in relation to the creative process. I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly, but I think that
because it is because it is a part of her creative process. Like her period does become a part of it because like it's affecting her emotionally, and she's having such an emotional response to the threat to the restaurant. Like they're both connected, and so she's just this big ball of anxiety and emotions. And as you said, like I don't think women when we're having our periods we ever really get away from it, because even when we have PMS, premenstrual syndrome, that starts before the period, and then after the period ends, you still have to come down on the emotions. So it's a continuous cycle of where women, as long once you start having your period as a teenager and before you have menopause, your entire life revolves around your period, and that affects your life. The only time we don't have our periods while women are in reproductive is when they're pregnant, and even some women still get like spotting during the pregnancy because it's just we can't get away from our wombs. You know, so like it's central to the story.
Yeah, and I think related to the creative process, I've been since making the movie, I've been more and more interested in thinking about like women's bodies and sort of separating it from the mythology of, like you said, it's like as you are from a very young age, you're thinking, I think as women, and I think what is unique about being a woman is that you are constantly aware of your body, I think, in a way that is unique to men. And I think maybe what is also interesting in looking at A Fermenting Woman is how, on the flip side, her period kind of just becomes an ingredient, which I've been sort of obsessed with. It's like this idea that as much as like it's like symbolic and it's very like rich in meaning, I think what's funny about Marielle is that she kind of just uses it as an ingredient, and it's very utilitarian, and so I think that's also interesting. It's also like maybe in my fantasy world is like kind of seeing this woman experience it, and ultimately by the end can't escape the fact that she's connected to this thing. So I think it's like sort of playing around with that idea too. It's just like a question of like what, and I think for me as a filmmaker, I want to play in these like fantasies as a way to like answer maybe questions that we've been asking. And so I think it's not super clear in the film, and I kind of like that. I think it's kind of a little bit muddy, and there were a lot of themes that we played around with, and yeah, so I think like I think the fact that the film and the plot centers on menstruation is a way for us to play with those ideas.
Yeah. I think we all are supposed to be denying our bodies all the time in relation to work, women especially, and but also people with chronic illnesses, people with disabilities. Like we're all trying to pretend all the time that we don't have bodies in our work lives, in the same way that we're pretending we don't have emotions. And I think that especially when you're in a creative profession, and one that, in film, it's often like very kind of difficult on the body, and I think we're kind of playing with that as well.
Yeah. And I guess like related to that, another layer of it too is that I think with film and being a filmmaker, for me personally, I'm always asking like, when do I have children? Because I think it's like a really hard career, and I think it's similar in the position of a chef. So I think we thought about Marielle. We wanted her to be. We wanted her to be a woman who was mature and like had experience, and we wanted to put out that question of like, is she someone who has sacrificed potentially her becoming a mother for her career? And I think that was something that we wanted to plant in like a very short time.
And the thing, so in developing the script for the film, I think because the film is a very visual film, like the cinematographer, Nikolai, I wrote it down, but I can't. I'm like, I can't even read my own handwriting. The film focuses very much on food and the process of food and what food looks like, and fermentation. Like fermentation is one of those things, like when we all did chemistry and biology in school, like they talk about fermentation, you see the bubbles rising and yeast and all that, but in crafting the script of for this film, I wanted to ask you, again, going back to the first question about how you wrapped your head around it being about periods and blood, the fermentation process is kind of gross looking. You know, it's like you're watching all these things get soft and mushy and gross, and they have a smell. You can't smell it there's no smell-o-vision, but you can get a sense.
Well, be able to.
But you can get a sense of it, like, because it, like, for me, I've been in the kitchen, and also, like, I eat so much different foods from different places. Like, fermentation does usually have a sour smell, you know, and like, so in crafting the script and in figuring out who Marielle is in relation to her food, what was that process like for you, especially the research that you would have to do? Like, for instance, she mentions natto. Like, natto is a Japanese, it's considered a superfood, but it's a Japanese dish, you know, and it's a fermentation dish. So if people who aren't familiar with Japanese food, if they watch this film, they'll be like, what the heck is that? But for you, as a writer, you have to do your research and figure out, okay, what is a food that is fermented that a chef like Marielle would work with? So talk to me about that and figuring out how it would work in conjunction to her period. Because I think the foods actually kind of reflect that in a visual way. I'm just like, they really went out of their way to make sure they found the grossest thing to show.
Yeah, I mean, I think the amazing thing about fermented foods is they're some of the most delicious foods, but they're some of the most disgusting foods at the same time. Like, and yeah, the smells and the sort of off gases and all the stuff that comes out of the process can be so disgusting, but the output is so amazing, but also is so subject to opinion. Like, you know, something that to me would be incredibly delicious could be disgusting to someone, and so much of it depends on your cultural background and what you're used to eating. And I think that was something that I think interested both of us a lot. And I mean, I've done some fermentation on my own, just out of my own interest, and you know, like I have done some kombucha brewing and all this stuff that has these really visceral, gross, weird, like the SCOBY. It's hard to even explain it. It's almost like a placenta or something. It's like this organ. But yeah, so I think the kind of the line between like delight and revulsion is really interesting to both of us. And I guess I was thinking about lab-grown meat as well. Like, we were sort of thinking about the fermentation, because the fermentation process, there's a lot of changing of textures and shapes, and it's a very transformative process. So we were sort of combining that with the idea of cells sort of reproducing in a lab-grown meat context a bit, but yeah, that it sort of becomes a reproductive process that ends up kind of expanding the substance, and yeah, the sort of revulsion and also joy and creation around it.
Yeah, it's there's some things that were very revolting. Like, when she starts to really work with the period blood and this thing that's growing, it is kind of like the lab-grown meat, but it also made me think of she was making a part of herself. You know, like, she was growing, and I didn't even think of it as in regards to like maybe even placenta or even like her uterus, but it was just this whole new part of her that she's growing and she's making, and it happens accidentally because she got drunk and just started to like make things, and I'm like, what are you even doing? And I'm like, how you can't even recreate this because you were drunk when you made it. But it's just talking about how there's beauty in the grotesque in something, especially with regards to food. You know, like, people will always be like, some of the most gross looking foods is some of the most delicious, but me, again, having an aversion to textures, I look at something and say, I don't care how delicious it is, if it does not look appetizing, I will not eat it. But the job of a chef is to make that as appetizing as possible, right? And I think for Marielle, that's one of her struggles, where she's trying to figure out, how do I make this thing appeal to these people who can take my job away from me, who can take my passion away from me, who can take my life away. And so she's like, I need to find a way to create that balance, you know. And I think a lot of this film is about fear, you know, fear of for a lot of women having the thing that we put our passions into stripped away from us, you know. And the funny thing is that for a lot of women, our peers actually kind of like tapped into that, because they're women who have to work through the excruciating pain of having a period to hold on to their jobs. You know, they say, I can't let this thing that happens to my body distract me from my job. But I'm just like, when it comes to men, like, they dedicate like entire weeks of their lives to things like fantasy football, and they don't get reprimanded for that, you know. I thought of Gordon Ramsay, who's one of the most well-known chefs, and he made a career out of being an emotional nutcase in a kitchen. You know, like that became his calling card. But for a woman like Marielle, she's like, I can't lose my composure. I can't be emotional. You know, my period is causing all of these hormonal changes in me, but I can't show that outwardly because I'm gonna be judged. But if it's a man, they'll be like, oh, he's passionate about his work, you know. And so I want you both to talk about that as both as creatives, you know, especially in the film industry where you're just like, film is about passion, it's about creating. But then like people will say you still can't be too emotional on the film set. But I'm like, you're making a film about passion and emotions. How are you not supposed to be emotional? Yeah. So I want you both to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think you're right. Like in terms of what is driving Marielle initially is fear, and I think for a lot of, I think as a creative person working in the film industry, it is it's so fragile, and nothing is ever, there's no security ever. And so I believe I am driven by fear in my career, because like on a monthly basis or project to project, I don't know what the next project is, and it's, you know, there's no security. But I think what we wanted to develop too in the film is when that fear gets overtaken by ego. And I think I like to think of Marielle as like she becomes, I think the artist's ego is very present by the end of the film, and I think that's something that, you know, ultimately throughout the creative process, maybe to me personally, I think she puts herself into the work, and she actually almost gets off on the fact that she is being consumed, which I think a part of what we do as filmmakers is we make things, we put it out there, and we want people to watch it. And I think if it was just about the creative process and creating, you don't get that fulfillment, and I don't think she would have been happy just like staying at home with her creature and just like hanging out with her creature. So I think that's a question. Like I think it's something that we are toying with in terms of like what do we do to ourselves and to our bodies ultimately to serve, you know, to serve what we are passionate about and our careers in the end. Yeah.
And I think just building on that, like, and what will we do to our own selves sometimes to serve that? Like, it is the ego, but sometimes we'll destroy ourselves to serve the product. And what does that do to us? And what is that?
Like, what's the cost in the end?
Yeah, and even though there is part, like, it's like she's getting off on it in a sense, but she's also being destroyed by it, which feels like kind of what it feels like to make art and put it out there.
But the thing is, ego can be healthy because ego is self-confidence, and like to be an artist, to be a filmmaker, to be a writer, and to be a chef or in any position where you have to give so much of yourself physically and mentally requires you have to have a certain level of ego, you know, where you're saying, I know I can do this, I know I can, like for I know I can make these amazing dishes, and I know these people will love it, and that should be enough, you know, because her track record proves it, her work as a chef proves it. But with these new owners coming in, she's feeling like she's falling short again of something that she should have never had to reach, you know. She's like, I shouldn't need to prove myself to these people because I've been here doing the work for as long as I can. But then because of that, I think, again, I mentioned fear because I think for a lot of people, fear also drives ego because they're afraid, again, of falling short, that people won't see their genius. You know, people won't see how beautiful their work is. And that's when ego becomes destructive. That's when ego becomes narcissism. You know, narcissism is driven, I think, in my view, is by fear of thinking that you're being judged, of fear of thinking that people are gonna see you as not being enough because you don't think you're enough. You know, it's kind of like a facade. And so she starts to build this facade, you know, and it starts to break down. And like again, I likened it to like a mad scientist, you know, like they're concocting all these concoctions, and she starts to lose herself, and her hair starts to get more wild. She's not being as well kept at home. She's because at the beginning of the film she's very well put together. She's very well presented. in how she's very well presenting and how she puts herself towards people in the kitchen. But as the film goes on and as the mania starts to overtake her, she starts to become sloppier. She doesn't keep the kitchen as pristine as it was at the beginning. Her hair is wild, her clothes are disheveled, and then that's where you really start to see how she feels internally manifesting externally. And the process of making this new dish is even more disgusting and vile than a normal fermentation process would make. It's just gross. And so I wanted to ask you, I think the funny thing for the name of the restaurant, the name of the restaurant that she's working at is called La Monstra. And at first I was thinking, does this mean the monster? But I was like, no, that doesn't sound right. I actually looked it up. It's Latin for to give or to show, right? And the film is again about not only her fear, but it's also about her showing and giving of herself. So talk to me about how the more she gives in the process of creating this new dish, the more she's showing that she's really, really not as well put together or held together as people think she is.
She's an unhinged gal.
I think that's another. The thing that she does on his is another thing.
I don't know, do you want to start? Or
I'm trying to think.
Yeah.
Thinking about, I guess it's, I'm trying to think. I might need a minute.
Yeah, in terms of her, I'll do a little shout out to the restaurant because we filmed this amazing restaurant and we loved it because it felt like it was almost like the kitchen, the architecture and how the layout was that the kitchen was the stage and the dining room was the audience. And I think in how Maisie structured the story and after spending time with the script in the kind of directing process of interpreting the screenplay, I always saw the finale as her final showing. It's like her final showing. And because it's a short, I think you go through the motions and very quickly, but also not, I think. I think there's enough time. It is a longer short. So I think we wanted to show her kind of start to unravel. And I'm so happy that you caught that she was kind of unraveling in that way psychologically and how it mimicked what she was making in the jar. But yeah, I guess I don't know where I'm going, but ultimately,
just let it take you where it's
but ultimately it's I think we always, especially with work, it's like a performance, right? You're never really who you truly are. I think at the beginning you kind of see her performing, and I do enjoy the fact that she becomes more unhinged because that's her true self. And I think as she's unraveling, what you see in the finale is her she closes off and kind of puts on her face, puts her hair back. But then when she finds out that she's actually been replaced, she's able to kind of release a bit of emotion. And I think that's probably the point in the film where you can empathize with her the most, because she's actually revealing her emotions, but then she quickly switches and she sort of becomes the monster that she creates. And yeah, I love the idea. I think forever I will continue to have an unhinged gal as a character in any of my films, just because I love how complicated it is. I think we grow up and we're told to kind of be proper, at least I was, to be proper and whatever, but I like kind of the idea that you don't have to be. I guess.
Yeah. And for so many of us, the body is the first thing to go. Taking care of our bodies goes before, when you're so busy that you forget to eat, or you're it's such a familiar feeling to I think to both of us, and also felt like a good way to provide visual cues to give the audience clues as to how she was really doing. Yeah.
And I want to talk a bit about consent, because another thing with this film is consent, where as a creative, what are the boundaries to which you can take your creative genius to the point where you're going too far? You're not considering your audience, your diners, as living, breathing entities with their own boundaries, where like just because they may not necessarily appreciate your genius doesn't mean that you have to voice your craziness onto them, because like for instance, like there's filmmakers where there are people who make projects, and I'll be like, you're doing this to torture the audience rather than to show off art, because there are some films, like again, there's some body horror films I can think of where I was just like, what was the point of this? I'm like, was this to edify your audience or was this to punish your audience? And for her, I like there is a point. Are you feeding your guests, your diners, or are you punishing your guests and your diners? And I kind of saw it as like she started to cross a boundary, and it's not just about her using her period blood for that. It could be for instance, it could be for instance, someone feeding someone something that they know they're allergic to. And it's like, and especially as a chef, your duty is to be as careful as possible, because your duty is to feed your guests, not harm your guests. And so she crossed, and it's the same thing with a doctor. They have a duty of care. Their Hippocratic oath, first do no harm. And I think it's the same thing for a chef. You're supposed to be nourishing. Your food is supposed to nourish, not harm. So I want to talk about that aspect of the film, because it shows how, yes, while she's justified in her rage and her anger and her fear and all these things, it's also like you're taking things a bit too far. Like there's only so much that I can give you, so much latitude I can give you in your grief and your emotions before you start to cross the boundary of the unforgivable act. So I want you both to talk about that, because
that's a hard one.
It's a really interesting question. It's really interesting too, because you're like, when you like thinking about it in relation to Marielle and the people eating her food, and then like as filmmakers and showing it to people, that's such an interesting parallel to draw. But I mean, I think with Marielle, there's no question in my mind that she is violating the consent of the people eating. It's not okay to feed oneself to other people without. But I think, it's really interesting to think about it in relation to making body horror and having things be revolting to your audiences. I mean, I see humor in the experience of watching the film, which I think kind of works with and against the kind of horror of it all and the revulsion. But I think it probably really depends a lot on how you take it in, because I know I've spoken to people who've been like very impacted by it in pure revulsion way. I find it humorous as well, but I think some of that is we can't control how people will experience it either. I don't know, what do you think?
It was a very interesting question. First and foremost, I like, in line with Maisie, Marielle crosses the boundary. Like, she's not, I don't think she's a complicated character, but I don't think she's like necessarily justified and right in what she's doing and within the world of the film. And in terms of, I mean, that's interesting, because I realized when you were talking about that you're uncomfortable with body horror, I was like, I should be sending this with like what do you call it?
You mean a trigger warning?
No, like a trigger warning. I realize now. But I think for me it goes back to ego. And let me like bring it back to a chef. Aside from like feeding someone who is allergic to nuts, I think that's nuts. That's a little like too much. But I think what fascinates me about fine dining is I guess within this world, it's like the position of the creator or the chef, who says like, and I think it involves a lot of trust. I think it's a relationship built on trust, and we talked about trust a lot in the film. And I think in the world of fine dining, I think when you experience like a chef's menu, like a chef's table kind of menu, where you can't choose what you eat, you can tell them what your allergies are, but like you can't choose what you eat. I think that involves a lot of trust, and I relate it to how a chef kind of has that contract with their audience per se, to say, trust me, I will feed you something within this one bite you're going to experience something and it's meant to be delicious. And I think that's what's interesting in like playing around with the role of the chef and Marielle and consent. I think with a filmmaker, perhaps it's a little bit different. Like I do think things need to like have a trigger warning, but I think I do believe that audiences have and should have more agency in what they are kind of walking into. And I think if it's labeled in the way that it is not deceiving, I feel like if you're always going to, if there's too much consent, are you going to lose that experience? And I think the experience of actually just experiencing the world of the film and how a story unfolds, and I think you can, I feel that way with like any sort of art form too.
And I agree, because the thing to me, one of the things that I love about film and why I do what I do is because I think film is a spectacular way of telegraphing to the world the things that bother us, you know, and present it in a way that people from a broad scope can understand. You know, for instance, like again, like this film it's a Canadian film, but people all over the world can relate to it because people all over the world go to not only restaurants, but they have their cooks. You know, they cook at home, and they have to consider how the food that they cook either for themselves or for their families and their loved ones is presented and made. You know, like how they feel when they're cooking and how the people who eat that food receive it. You know, so it's a universal experience, and like. And while I was watching this film, it made me think of how, again, like going back a bit to male and female dynamics in certain spaces and creatives being allowed to be as creative as possible in the making process. A lot of people might compare this film to you know, The Menu, the film with the refined, but actually I was thinking this film actually more goes with Frankenstein's monster.
It's great.
You know, I talked about Frankenstein. I was thinking this film falls more in line with a film like Frankenstein's monster, and because it's about, again, not only consent, but how far do you go with regards to like your creative genius? You know, like Frankenstein, he made this monster, and he never actually gave the monster the opportunity to consent to be turned into a monster. You know, and like. Everyone thinks of Frankenstein's monster and they call the monster Frankenstein's monster, but then people always forget it's actually Frankenstein who is the actual monster of the story. You know, because he desecrated his body, he used his genius to take someone's life and distort it and morph it and turn them into this monster that people feared. You know, and like for food, using again food as a context, it's the same way where Marielle made her food into something for people to fear rather than to enjoy and to love. You know, and it's about the whole creative process, like how far should you go before your ability to create, because what she did, if you look at it from a scientific perspective, would be considered genius. Like she did a whole science experiment and it worked. You know, but it's again like, but just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Right.
You know, and even just looking at the food itself, it became this breathing thing. It was alive, and it was suffocating. Like when she started to put it into the Ziploc bag, because I recognize that bag. That's the thing that they do it's the thing where you put it into water and you slow cook it, sous vide, and that's what she was gonna do. I'm like, is she gonna sous vide this thing? But it was breathing, and I'm like, but then I was like, but she's suffocating it. You know, I'm like, you're killing it, and you're also killing yourself in the process because she started to breathe hard, and I'm like, that's why I was thinking, oh, this isn't her uterus. I'm like, this is your lung, this is your heart, because she started to breathe harder and more difficult. I'm like, you're killing yourself by distorting the thing that you love. You know, so. And then when she's feeding it to them, it's bleeding. And I'm like, it's hurting. I actually start to see it as a sentient thing. I'm like, but this thing is hurt. I actually start to feel sorry for her. I'm like, what are you doing? You're hurting it. I'm like, stop killing it. Right?
Don't eat it.
Right? But like for a lot of people, art is a living, breathing thing. Film is a living, breathing thing, because you have all of these people, dozens of people who come together to make a film, and like they put their heart and soul into it. You know, and so it's whether it's a film, whether it's writing a book where you have editors and printers, all these people who, like, I never see art as a singular creative endeavor. There's multiple people involved with making an art piece. Whether if you're a sculptor, the people who bring you your marble are part of your creative process. You know, the people who like put it into the museum and curate it are part of the creative process. And I was thinking, I'm like, Mary, you aren't considering your art to be a team effort, a creative process for everyone, because you made your dish. Okay, you created this thing in the lab, but okay, the vegetables were grown by someone else. You know, the plate was created by an artisan. You know, all the other ingredients came from other people. I'm like, you're destroying their efforts to create this thing for you. And that's again where it's about the ego, the narcissism, the selfishness of it all. And so I kind of saw the film as not only about Marielle, but about how she was distorting the work and the efforts of so many other people because of her vengeance and her revenge. So and so in talking about the creative process and being a team effort, this film, I have to ask you about working with the food stylist, Matthew Chen, and again, the composer and the cinematographer, because like, I love the cinematography in this film. It's so clear and it's so present and everything has life. Like I said, I started to see this thing that she made as a sentient being partly because of the cinematography and partly how it was styled. So talk to me about working with them and with the composer, Marie-Helene Delorme. Like talk to me about the creative process and the team effort.
Yeah, I love my team. So Nikolai Mihailov is our cinematographer. I've worked with him on many projects, but as a producer. So it's my first time working with him as a director. And I think with him and in putting together the team, they were really put together, like they were all really just like my friends and colleagues. And it was really nice because, to be honest, we didn't have a ton of funding for the film, as most short films.
The life of an independent.
Yeah. So a lot of the folks who joined on, of course, like not full rates, like really in it to just like make something happen, to make it work. But Nikolai's, I think his strengths is in prioritizing story. I think he has a very unique style that's like specific to him, and you'll see it in the films that he's worked on. But they're always not very different, but they all serve the story. And I think when we started talking, we got really into it, and we had reference, like we talked about like films that we really loved, like Rosemary's Baby and and like Dogtooth, which is Yorgos.
Yorgos Lanthimos, right?
Yeah, and so I think like I wanted it to be weird, and he was on board, and I think in terms of like the visuals, I think we wanted to kind of hone in on like a macro world, which is like kind of zoomed in on like the fermentation and biological processes, and then also the like Marielle's world, and it's divided into kind of three settings. It's like her garden, her home, and the kitchen. And so we kind of wanted to give those spaces character, and he did an amazing job doing it with like very little resources. So that's Nikolai, and then Matthew Chin. It was my first time working with a food stylist, and we needed the support to like have someone kind of carry and have like a vision for the food itself, because food played such a huge role in the film. And so he did like a ton of research. I think it was his first like narrative film project. And he was just on board, and he would like send me like photos of what he was working on, and he was just so smart, and like the research that he did, and just fermentation, and I sent him some references, and he like totally got it. And like thank God that like Noma is such a like thing now, which is why
I actually did research lead fermenter in the world is David Dilber. He's from Scarborough, Toronto. And so that was a fun thing because it was like, oh look, the lead fermenter who works for Noma restaurant in Copenhagen, I think it is, right?
Yeah.
Is things. I was actually going to ask you about that, about if you kind of used him as like a reference for the character.
Yeah, not for the character, I don't think, but more so just in terms of the world of fermentation. I forget what the book is called, but Noma put out a book.
Is Noma's Fermentation Lab?
Yes.
Okay.
Noma's Fermentation Lab, which is like, it came out, I think during the pandemic or around that time, and I was like obsessed with like fine dining and just food in general, and so I think that was like a huge reference. And then you read some books, Sandor.
Oh yeah, Sandor Alex Katz, his book Wild Fermentation, which I had gotten into like a long time ago, and that
watched the film, by the way.
Oh really?
Yeah, he liked
cool.
it. Yeah. So shout out to Sandor.
That's so cool. Yeah.
So there were like some references that helped, I think, Matt with just like creating the world, and then. But Matt, in collaboration with our special effects team too, Black Spot FX, also Toronto based, they just had like worked on Cronenberg's last film, so we were like super stoked to work with them, and they did a lot of the like, so all of the effects like the blood, and they were all practical effects, and she, Alexandra Anger, and Monica Pavez, like they both kind of helped basically put the food and the effects together, so that was amazing. And then Marie-Helene, she is a composer who I'd been following, and she worked on an indie, a Toronto film a few years ago that my costume designer worked on, and so I reached out, and I initially like had in my brain, I'm forgetting his name, I'm so bad at this. What is the composer?
The composer
Cristobal,
who did White Lotus.
Yeah, the composer did White Lotus.
Well.
Cristobal something.
Yeah.
Sorry. But anyways, so that kind of music was like really interesting to me and intriguing, and I'd sent Marie-Helene when she hopped on like some references, and she was like totally got it, and I think I had like Plantasia as a reference as well. But I think part of what I loved working on the script with Maisie was like Maisie injected the humor in the film, and I honestly don't think, I think when I first started thinking about the movie, I always thought of it as like maybe a darker, maybe more sensual film. Before the story took shape, I was just thinking like, oh, this would be like really dark and sensual and like witchy, and it's still like witchy. It's still, I don't know if it's sensual at all, actually, but I think you inject it. But I think the humor in it, and so I like wanted to capture the like brightness and the levity of the world, and I think it's like, as much as it is that, you know, Marielle's unhinged and she's going into a dark place, she's coming from a place that is about growth and creation, and I think I wanted to have like life injected in the film throughout, and I think Marie-Helene's score is really doing that. Like I think there's a lot of like, there's something like alien,
especially in the beginning, the opening pieces, kind of like very alienish, very electronica type of music.
Yes,
and then she ended up with something kind of made me think of the Carpenters. I was like, wow, how did we go from like alien music to music that's something the Carpenters would sing? I'm like, what's happening here?
I think I also wanted to go against the grain of fine dining and like classical music. So I wanted the score to be electronic, but like played with in a different way. But yeah, she did a really good job, and I think she, as along with the sound designers, like I think she humanized the creature, because she would like have these like tones and like like almost like the creature had a voice, and I think she built that into the score, but then also with the sound design.
So, everyone, so we are now in a new location, so it's not just one-on-one. So I have Priscilla here, so we're going to begin wrapping up the interview. So before we wrap up, we have to talk about our lead actress, Sook-yin Lee, who played the character of Marielle. So, she, as I had said previously, she's fantastic. Like, she's all of these things. She's all of these amazing aspects of this woman. She's sad, she's angry, she's anxious, she's monstrous, she's a genius, you know, she's a person who makes extremely bad decisions. And then as Priscilla, I like that you used the word unhinged. So talk to me about working with Sook-yin. How did you find Sook-yin, and what was the casting process like for her?
Yeah, so our choice in Sook-yin kind of came pretty early in the process. I think I tossed the idea to Maisie pretty early in the writing process. For me, I've known Sook-yin since I was a little girl. You know, growing up in like small town Ontario, watching much music. I always looked up to Sook-yin as, you know, an Asian girl who wanted to work in entertainment, wanted to do cool things, and Sook-yin was like always the coolest. And so I'd always admired her from like a very young age. When I moved to Toronto and started working in the industry, she was someone that I'd followed, and also she's also a director, she's a musician, she does all the things, she's an actress, and I knew she was in a film called Short Bus, which is amazing. And so just knowing kind of like all this, like, you know, everything around Sook-yin, and her being kind of really active in the Asian Canadian film community too, and like she had like links to Real Asian Film Festival, who like I'm super proud to have like been programmed at. A feature that I produced was at Real Asian, and so I was able to connect with her through like contacts and like colleagues in the industry. So that was something that I wanted to do from the very beginning, and I thought Sook-yin, especially in Short Bus, she just like, I just love that she's an interdisciplinary artist who has like a wide range of interests, but also I think she is open to doing like, to be weird and doing kind of like outrageous things, and I just wanted to work with an artist who could like be unafraid of this concept that we had. And so she was just like top of mind, and I'm so grateful that she agreed to it. And I think, as you know, like as Maisie said when I initially talked to her about the concept, I'm a little bit shy at first about like kind of sharing what the film is about, but there is no hiding it, so eventually it comes out. So I kind of just like went full force and shared the concept with her, and you know, like for me, and also as like for me, it's like it doesn't hurt to ask, and it's free to ask. You know, it's like it doesn't. You know, you just like see where it goes, and that's sort of how I took it.
And what was her response when you told her the film was about periods?
I think she was really open to it. I think she was just like, I think what really interested her, what I recall from our initial conversations, were that she was interested in how like there isn't a ton of dialogue, so I think she kind of saw it as like potential to kind of take a character and like almost a nonverbal, like Marielle's sort of nonverbal in it, which I think is interesting, and I think she saw it as like a potential for performance. So I think that was something, and I think she understood where Maisie and I were kind of going for in terms of like the body and the limits between like what is acceptable and not, and I think that was something that like themes that she related to.
Yeah, because the thing is like Marielle doesn't speak verbally, but I think she speaks through her food. You know, for a lot of chefs, their food is the way they communicate to the world. So for her food is how she communicates to people. You know, and so she was telegraphing all of her emotions into these dishes that she was crafting. That's why it became more unhinged. The more her emotions started to become more unstable, you know, her food started to become more unstable, and I think that's why the taste was affected. Before she started even made the last dish, like the few dishes that she made for the restaurant manager, he was like something was off, and it was because her emotions were off, right? So like a lot of Sook-yin's acting is very much in how she uses her body and her face, and like the agitation that she showed. And I think she did a fantastic job with just like bringing the audience into how she feels, because from the opening you get the sense she's not all there anymore, like she's not completely balanced. So in the process, were there any particular scenes that perhaps she struggled with, or that you really had to work with her and say, okay, this is really because like she has to use because her performance is so physically external. Was there anything that was a bit more of a challenge for her?
I would say, I think the hardest scene to direct, and I don't want to speak for Sook-yin, but I think the hardest scene to direct would have been the finale. And I think part of it was because, of course, as indie filmmaking goes, it was the last thing that we shot, and it was like very early in the morning after like we kind of gone like a long day already, and it was hard, but we knew we had to knock up this scene, and it was challenging because like a lot of the performances is just like through her face, and I think I wanted to convey a myriad of emotions, which was like sort of the excitement of presenting your artwork, then transitioning to like kind of beyond the excitement and almost like in an erotic way, like what I've said before, just like getting off on like just being able to for your work to be consumed by others after like working so hard to do it, but then quickly would then turn into the fear that something is happening to her body and the pain. So it was like there were big shifts for her to work through. But at the same time, there was a practical stunt of setting off the blood gag, where she experiences the bleeding and her like next cycle menstruation kind of going full force, and that was, she had to wear this like rig, which was connected to a tube that had like a blood. It was like this thing that like spurted out blood, and it was complicated, and we had very limited takes for it. So I think that was the hardest I think from a performance standpoint and directing performance, that was probably the hardest scene.
And so for my last question for you, because like something that we've been talking about throughout this whole interview is the creative process and how much it takes from us, and how much we have to give to it, especially for filmmakers. Like your art is how you're relating to the world, how you think, and what you think about the world. And this film is, I think, also very much about what you think about the female body, the experiences of the female body. And so for you as a filmmaker, in making a film that, as you said, that you were shy to mention about it being about peers, but also about being the trauma of peers and the stress of the creative process. How has making this film perhaps changed the way that you look at your art and the struggles that you go through to make your art and, like to birth your art, as you say,
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I would say I feel very opposite. I think the ego, like my questions around ego and like exploration of it, it's the first thing that I directed something in film school, but when I graduated film school, I've been producing since then, and I've been working with like amazing directors, but this is the first time I'm kind of transitioning from producer to director, and I think it's a really interesting experience because I think a lot of my feelings and frustrations and that I was trying to that I was able to communicate through the film in terms of like, putting yourself into this work maybe was being translated through my experience as a producer, because I think in me I always just like wanted to be the creator of something. And I think since I've been able to like make this film, I've scratched that itch, and I think it's like maybe it's just been like really joyful in general. I feel like I just like worked with like my best friends, and it's been really great. And I think the reception, I think it was hard to go through the process of submitting the film to film festivals, because what I realized was like there is just like that a ton of rejection that comes with it. But I've just been riding the like experience of like sort of like being in the director's seat of something, and it's been really joyful actually, and I don't feel as much of that like, oh, I sacrificed so much and like, you know, but you know, this is all just like, I'm just exploring themes, and that's been interesting to me. I would like to say too, I think the film and making the film has made me kind of hone into like what themes I want to like continue working on. And I think when I said earlier, just like the idea of like a woman's experience and sort of working with fantasy and using films as a way for me to fantasize maybe different realities is something that I'd like to keep doing.
Yeah, no, and I think that's great, you know, especially I'm always interested, one of the reasons I like talking to like young filmmakers in particularly is that you're now finding your voice as a creative, you know, like you're now being able to shape the trajectory of your path, but also you're trying to figure out, you know what, these are the stories that I want to tell. You know, I think it's very different than, for instance, like speaking to filmmakers who've been making films for like 30, 40, 50 years, like you're now finding, and the world is so much different now, you know, like people would say the world is your oyster, but I don't think that's it, because I've always found that same kind of weird, because the oyster is closed. Like, oh, like why is the world your oyster if the oyster is closed? You know, but like you're able to like, you know what, I can do this, because you got to show it at film festivals. You won 2 awards for A1 at Minikino, and it's showing you like people do want stories like this, you know, and like even if you might be feeling shy or nervous and apprehensive of making a story that deals with such a very personal topic as peers, is showing that these things shouldn't really be seen as anything to hide, you know, or to be ashamed of. Like, the stories about these things are necessary. Like, there are films about serial killers. Why are we hesitant to watch films about someone having their period? Like,
Totally.
Why?
Yeah, exactly.
You know? I love it. So I think it's great that you're now being able to discover who you are as a filmmaker and like what you want to do with your art, and the kind of stories you want to tell.
It's been a great process.
It is, and like, thank you so much for talking.
Thank you for having me. It was so nice talking to you. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you. No, this was great, because it does help me to be more. I'm trying to add things. I'm 41 years old. I've written about having a hysterectomy in my periods and stuff. I'm like, why am I nervous watching a film about a period, but I can write a whole piece about having a hysterectomy? What is that? What is that? But no, but I really enjoy you talking to me, and like it really did help me to really understand like your feelings about the film and like why you made it.
Thank you.
And so I appreciate you taking the time for talking to me.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
So for Maisie, one of the last questions I want to ask you is, we spoke a bit about developing the character and the trajectory she was on. Like, for you, what was like, when did you realize that the script you had developed was completed? Because I know for like, you know, there's people who say like you can keep adding to a script, but you have to keep in mind you're writing for a short film. Like, you know, when did you know that, especially for a character like Sook-yin, from Marielle, who doesn't speak much, you know, she's like, a lot of her performance is through her body language, you know, her expressions and her anxiety comes through the way that Sook-yin portrayed it. So how did you know, you know what, this is, we're finished, you know, this is the story we want to tell?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's almost kind of a silent film.
In a way, yeah,
like,
she doesn't talk much.
No, there's not much dialogue, but I mean, I think Priscilla and I had spoken about casting, you know, she had spoken about casting Sook-yin really early on, and I guess I knew that Sook-yin was a really great actor, and that she was going to be able to bring something really interesting to it. I don't know how you know when something's done.
You know?
I don't know. I never know when something's done. I think it's just kind of, I mean, that's the wonderful thing about working with someone, is maybe, you know, this sort of combination of visions can maybe figure that out in a way that's helpful. But
while you may not necessarily know when a film may be done instinctually, I kind of see like I've been comparing, right, making the film the same to like a chef creating, you know. And for some chef, like again, like a chef like Marielle, who's always seeking perfection, you know, she's always thinking, if I add just this one ingredient, it could be perfect. But then wait, it's not quite perfect. You know, she's going to keep adding and adding. But then you have to trust your voice. So for you, so instead of asking, how do you know when you've made the perfect story, I'm going to ask you, how did you learn to trust your voice as a writer?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think the beauty of filmmaking is it's not one voice. It's like it's a collaborative process, and it's a chorus of voices, and especially working with a director who's so talented, it really just, you kind of birth it and pass it along, and then they do their magic. And it was really amazing, because I was really not around at all for the production process. And it was really amazing to not be a part of that and then see it at the end and just be completely blown away by what Priscilla did and what the whole team came up with. And yeah, Sook-yin's performance was incredible. But I think to me that's kind of the beauty of collaboration, is it's a bunch of voices.
So what did you think of it when it was all said and done? When it was all completed and you saw it, what was your feelings about this story, about your part in the story?
I mean, I was really excited about it. It was really nice to step away and come back and just kind of, I was really impressed by what Priscilla did and what the team did, and to me it's kind of a gift to be able to not be a part of that and to come back and see what happens and kind of see how everyone interprets it. And
see, that's interesting to me, because I'm such a curious person. Like, I'm always like wanting to know how things are done. For me, that could be me. I would want to be on set, and it's not that you don't trust the team. It's just that I would want to see how they're like the step-by-step process of how they're bringing the story alive. So I think it's interesting that you said that you were happy not being there, because I would be like, I want to see how they did this. How did they interpret the scene that I created? So I think it's fascinating that you're like that. That's just tell me I want to be there every single day. But in doing that, I'll ask the last question I asked Priscilla. I asked her, how did making this film kind of perhaps change the way she saw her own creative process and creating and her finding her voice as a filmmaker, now that she's able to like start her career, and she's like, this is the path I want to take for you. Like, how has the film perhaps inspired your own creative process and the steps you want to take as a writer, like in helping you to more hone your voice as a creator, especially because again, this is a story that doesn't require a lot of dialogue. You have to be more economical in the story you're telling. You have to make sure that every word is not a line that can be easily discarded. Like everything that the characters say and do matters. So like, how has making a film like this influenced, or I should say, is informing the way you want to continue your career?
I mean, I had recently been working in television, doing writing for television, and it's just such a different, it's like completely different. And so it's all about fitting into a very specific template, which is a fun and interesting challenge in itself, but on its own. But I guess this felt like being able to step away from that, and just felt like it was, Priscilla and I both knew it was going to be weird, and we were kind of going into it with a very kind of a sense of freedom in terms of that. It didn't have to fit into a category. It didn't have to be comfortable to watch, or like a certain number of jokes a minute, or any of that kind of stuff. It was just kind of quiet and contemplative, and felt like it was kind of coming from sort of like, I don't know, mythology and we were talking about Frankenstein, and it sort of felt like it was coming from like a quieter sort of ancient place, which is a weird thing to say about a film, but
no, it actually kind of makes sense.
Yeah,
and it really made me think. I thought about Frankenstein, but I also thought of like some old films like Nosferatu and like those kind of stories about the macabre, the dark and the deep. Like a lot of older films were about a lot of very deep and dark stories, where a lot of TV now in these days isn't really about stuff like that. So like, it did give you a chance to tap into a different aspect of your filmmaking, not filmmaking, of your writing voice. You're like, I can write dark. You're like, I can write horror now.
Yeah, I think that was really fun, and it was like pretty cathartic in a way to do this kind of writing. And I think also just working with an artist who has a very strong vision like Priscilla does is always a pleasure. And I'm really interested in the process of collaboration and what that can look like, and I think that was a big part of the joy for me too, is just kind of throwing ideas back and forth, and us both bringing different elements to it, and just kind of seeing what can happen when it's a bunch of brains coming together.
And I think that's great, because again, like, one of the main themes to me for the film is the collaborative effort, because even though Marielle is the center of the film, it made me think of how all the people involved with bringing a recipe together, you know, like I mentioned, there's the gardeners, the produce providers, and those kind of people. Like, it's not just the chef, it's all the people who provide the ingredients. There's the sous chefs, you know, the commis chefs, and all these people involved making a recipe. So the film is very much, I think, about collaborative, the unseen hands in the craft, you know. So like for you as a writer, like your hand is kind of like the unseen hand in the craft making process, you know. So I think like you all did a fantastic job, and again it made me have to reevaluate the way I look at periods, you know, and like the way why as a grown-up woman am I squeamish about watching films like this. I'm like, why? I'm fine watching horror films, slasher films, why? So like I told Mary, like I've written about women and periods and that kind of stuff. I'm like, but why is watching a film so much more difficult, you know? So I appreciate that the film challenged me, and it made me have to really like think about growing at that part of myself as an audience, you know. So I really appreciate that, and I appreciate you taking the time for talking to me and for everything that you guys did. I think everyone did a fantastic job.
Thank you so much for having us and for your extremely thoughtful questions.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks.